The airplane descended through clouds over Accra, and Louis Armstrong pressed his face against the window like a child seeing the ocean for the first time. Below him, the coast of West Africa stretched golden and green, a landscape he had never seen but somehow recognized in his bones. His wife Lucille sat beside him, holding his hand, feeling the tremor of emotion he was trying to contain. "You all right, Pops?" she asked softly. Louis didn't answer immediately. He couldn't find words for what he was feeling. After 55 years of life, after decades of traveling the world, performing for presidents and royalty, after becoming one of the most famous men on the planet, Louis Armstrong was about to step onto African soil for the first time. And what neither he nor anyone else on that plane could possibly anticipate was that waiting for him below were not hundreds, not thousands, but 100,000 people who had been standing in the heat for hours, waiting to welcome home a man who had never been home before. It was May 1956, and the world was changing in ways both terrible and hopeful. The Cold War had divided the planet into armed camps, each side competing for the allegiance of newly independent nations. Africa was awakening from centuries of colonial rule, with countries declaring independence and asserting their right to self-determination. Ghana, formerly the British colony of Gold Coast, was on the verge of becoming the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence from European control. The excitement, the sense of possibility, the feeling that history was turning a corner, all of it was electric in the air. And into this moment of transformation came Louis Armstrong, sent United States State Department as a cultural ambassador, a goodwill gesture meant to demonstrate American friendship and support. But for Louis, this trip was something more than diplomacy, something deeper, something he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. He had grown up in New Orleans, in neighborhoods where the memory of slavery was not distant history but living trauma. His grandmother had been born into bondage. The stories she told, the songs she sang, the warnings she gave about never trusting white authority, all of it carried the weight of stolen ancestry. Louis knew his people had come from Africa. He knew that somewhere in his bloodline, someone had been captured, chained, forced onto a ship, and transported across an ocean to build wealth for people who considered them property. But that knowledge had always been abstract. Theoretical, a historical fact that lived in his head but not in his heart. The trip to Ghana was supposed to change that, or at least that's what people told him. Other Black Americans who had made the journey spoke about it in mystical terms, describing the moment they touched African soil as a spiritual homecoming, a reconnection with ancestral roots that had been violently severed. Louis wanted to feel that. He wanted the trip to mean something profound, to heal something broken, to answer questions he'd been carrying his entire life about identity and belonging. But he was also nervous. What if he didn't feel anything? What if Africa remained as foreign to him as Europe or Asia? What if the connection everyone promised him was real turned out to be wishful thinking? What if he was just a tourist after all, gawking at someone else's home? And pretending it was his. The State Department had prepared him for official ceremonies, formal dinners, carefully choreographed performances in proper venues. They'd briefed him on protocol, on what to say and what not to say, on representing American democracy and American culture in the most positive possible light. What they hadn't prepared him for, what they couldn't have prepared him for because they fundamentally didn't understand it, was the emotional magnitude of what this trip meant to the people of Ghana. To them, Louis Armstrong wasn't just a famous musician. He was a son returning, a brother stolen by history and finally making his way back, the living embodiment of millions who had been taken and could never return. When the plane touched down at Accra Airport, Louis could hear something unusual even before the engine stopped. A sound. Like distant thunder, like an ocean wave building, like something too big to be contained. The crew looked confused, checking instruments, trying to determine what was causing the vibration they could feel through the aircraft itself. But Lucille knew. She squeezed Louis's hand tighter and whispered, "Baby, I think they're here for you." The door opened, the stairs were positioned, and Louis Armstrong, wearing his best suit, his trumpet case in hand, stepped out into the African sunlight. The roar that greeted him was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. 100,000 voices screaming his name, singing, crying, celebrating. The airport was packed beyond capacity. The roads leading to the airport were rivers of people. The buildings surrounding the airfield had people hanging from windows, standing on roofs, waving flags and banners. Children held up signs with his name painted in bright colors. Women danced in traditional dress, men beat drums. The entire city of Accra, it seemed, had emptied itself to be here for this moment. Louis stood at the top of the stairs, completely overwhelmed, tears streaming down his face before he'd taken a single step. He had performed for stadiums full of people. He had seen crowds go wild with enthusiasm. But this was different. This wasn't applause for his talent. This was something else entirely. This was recognition. This was family. This was 100,000 people telling him with their voices and their presence that he mattered not because of what he could do, but because of who he was. A black man who had survived, who had succeeded, who had made the world pay attention to black excellence and black humanity. And now, he was here, standing on the soil his ancestors had been stolen from, and they were welcoming him home. The official greeting committee struggled to get through the crowd. Ghana's soon-to-be Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah had come personally to welcome Louis, a gesture that indicated just how significant this visit was considered. But even Nkrumah, who commanded immense respect and authority, could barely move through the pressing mass of humanity. Everyone wanted to touch Louis, to see him, to be part of this moment. Security tried to create space to maintain order, but this was beyond their capacity to control. This was spontaneous, overwhelming, unstoppable joy. Louis descended the stairs slowly, still crying, his trumpet case clutched to his chest like a talisman. When his foot touched the ground, touched African soil for the first time in his life, something happened inside him that he would struggle to explain for the rest of his days. It felt like remembering something he'd never known, like finding something he hadn't realized he'd lost, like a circle completing itself after being broken for 300 years. He knelt down and touched the ground with his hand, and the crowd's roar intensified into something that sounded almost like a prayer. Kwame Nkrumah finally reached him, embracing Louis with tears in his own eyes. "Welcome home, brother," Nkrumah said, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home." Those two words, spoken by this man who was leading his nation to independence, who represented Africa's reclamation of its own destiny, hit Louis like physical blows. Home. Was this home? Could it be home when he'd never been here before, when his language was English? His culture was American, his experience was New Orleans jazz clubs and Chicago recording studios. What did home even mean? The motorcade from the airport to the city took 3 hours to travel what should have been a 20-minute journey. The roads were completely packed with people, all wanting to see Louis, to celebrate his arrival, to be part of this historic moment. Louis stood in the open car, waving, crying, laughing, overwhelmed. Everywhere he looked, he saw faces that looked like his mother's, like his grandmother's. He saw the skin tones that had been mocked and discriminated against in America treated here as ordinary, as normal, as beautiful. He saw black people in positions of authority, wearing uniforms, directing traffic, managing crowds. He saw a world where blackness wasn't a problem to be solved, but simply the way things were. The concerts Louis performed in Ghana were unlike anything in his long career. The venues were packed beyond fire code capacity. People stood in the aisles, sat on windowsills, climbed into rafters. And when Louis played, when that trumpet sang out the blues and the joy and the pain and the survival of black people across the diaspora, the response was overwhelming. People didn't just applaud, they wept, they called out, they sang along. They treated his music not as entertainment but as testimony, as a conversation between souls separated by an ocean and 3 centuries, but still, somehow, speaking the same language. Between sets, Louis would stand backstage, still processing what was happening. His band members were equally moved and confused. They were professional musicians, used to enthusiastic crowds, but this was something else. They're not just listening to the music, one of them observed. They're listening to us, like we're telling them something they've been waiting to hear. And that was exactly right. Every note Louis played carried the story of survival, of creativity forged in oppression, of beauty built from pain. And the people of Ghana heard that story and recognized it as their own. But the trip wasn't only triumph and joy. It was also complicated, confusing, sometimes painful. Louis attended formal dinners where African leaders discussed politics and history, using references and contexts he didn't fully understand. He visited villages where people spoke languages he couldn't comprehend, practiced customs he didn't recognize, lived lives completely foreign to his experience. He was American, thoroughly and completely American, and no amount of ancestral connection could change the fact that he was a stranger here. that his home, his real lived home, was the United States with all its racism and violence and also with all its music and memory and meaning. One evening, sitting on a hotel balcony overlooking the ocean, Louis talked to Lucille about the contradiction tearing at him. "They call this home," he said quietly, "and I feel something, I do, but I also feel like a tourist. Like I'm visiting someone else's home and pretending it's mine. That makes me feel guilty, like I'm not black enough, not African enough. But then I think my grandmother was a slave. My ancestors didn't choose to leave here. They were stolen, so why do I feel like I don't belong?" Lucille held his hand and said something wise. "Maybe you belong to both places. Maybe that's what the diaspora means, not that you're from here or from there, but that you're from the breaking and the building both." The emotional peak came during a visit to Cape Coast Castle, one of the slave trading forts where captured Africans had been held before being shipped to the Americas. Louis walked through the dungeons where his ancestors might have been imprisoned, saw the door of no return through which they'd been forced onto ships, felt the weight of history pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. He stood in that place of trauma and wept for people whose names he'd never know, whose faces he'd never see, whose lives had been destroyed to create the world he'd been born into. And the Ghanaians who toured the castle with him wept too, sharing the grief, acknowledging the wound. After 2 weeks in Ghana, Louis had to leave. The State Department had more tours scheduled, more countries to visit, more diplomatic duties to fulfill. But he was leaving Ghana changed, transformed in ways he was still trying to understand. The 100,000 people who had greeted him at the airport came again to see him off, though in smaller numbers this time. The initial frenzy had been replaced by something quieter but no less meaningful, an acknowledgement, a blessing, a recognition that he had come and been received and that something important had happened. On the flight back to America, Louis was unusually quiet. Lucille let him be, understanding that he needed time to process. Finally, hours into the flight, he spoke. "I'm going to be different now," he said. "I don't know how exactly, but I can't go back to being who I was before this. I've seen too much, felt too much," and he was right. Louis Armstrong, who returned from Ghana, was still the brilliant musician, still the charismatic performer, still the man with the famous smile. But there was a depth to him now, a weight, a consciousness that hadn't been there before. He started speaking more openly about racism, about colonialism, about the connections between black struggles worldwide. He started using his platform not just for entertainment, but for education, for consciousness raising, for solidarity. The impact of Louis' Ghana trip extended far beyond his personal transformation. The images of him being welcomed by 100,000 people were broadcast around the world, including in the segregated American South, where black people were still fighting for basic civil rights. Seeing Louis treated with such reverence and joy in Africa sent a powerful message. It reminded black Americans that they were part of a larger story, a global community, a diaspora that stretched across oceans and continents. It reminded them that their value as human beings didn't depend on white acceptance or approval, that somewhere in the world there were places where blackness was celebrated, where being descended from Africa was a source of pride rather than shame. The State Department, which had sponsored the trip as a Cold War propaganda exercise, got more than they bargained for. Yes, Louis represented American culture and American achievement, but he also represented something they hadn't fully considered: the possibility of black solidarity across national borders, the idea that black people might identify more with each other than with their respective governments, the suggestion that the African independence movement and the American civil rights movement were connected struggles against connected oppressions. Louis's trip to Ghana helped strengthen those connections, helped build those solidarities, helped create networks of support and understanding that would fuel liberation movements for decades to come. In his later interviews, when asked about the most meaningful moment of his career, Louis would often mention Ghana, not because of the music he played there, though it was excellent, not because of the crowds, though they were unprecedented, but because of what it taught him about identity, about belonging, about the complexity of home. "I learned that home isn't just where you're from," he'd say. "It's also where you're received, where you're recognized, where people see you and say, 'You belong here.' I belonged in Ghana even though I'd never been there, and I belong in America even though America hasn't always wanted me to belong." That contradiction, that complexity, that's what it means to be black in the modern world. The 100,000 people who waited for Louis Armstrong at that Accra airport in 1956 were waiting for more than a musician. They were waiting for confirmation that the scattered children of Africa could still find their way back, that the wounds of slavery hadn't completely severed the connections, that recognition was still possible across the distance and the trauma. And when Louis stepped off that plane, when he touched African soil and wept, when he played his trumpet and heard it echo back to him in the voices of 100,000 people singing his name, something was healed. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to matter, enough to remember, enough to build on today. The story of Louis Armstrong in Ghana is taught in history classes, analyzed in academic papers, referenced in discussions of diaspora and identity and cultural diplomacy. But the most important thing about that trip wasn't what it represented in theoretical terms. It was what it felt like to the people who lived it. To Louis, standing overwhelmed by emotion, trying to understand what it meant to be called home by people he'd never met. To the Ghanaians, welcoming back a symbol of survival, a living testament to resilience, a brother who'd been lost and was now found. To the millions of Black people around the world who saw those images and felt something shift inside themselves, some small expansion of possibility, some quiet recognition that their story was bigger than they'd been taught. The airplane lifted off from Accra, carrying Louis back to America. Back to the complicated reality of being Black in a country that loved his music but not always his humanity. But he was bringing something with him now, a memory, a connection, a knowledge that somewhere in the world 100,000 people had stood in the heat for hours just to welcome him home, that they'd sung his name like a prayer, that they'd recognized him as kin. That they'd treated his presence as sacred, as meaningful, as the return of something precious that had been stolen and was now, finally, if only briefly, restored. And that memory, that connection, that knowledge would sustain Louis Armstrong for the rest of his life. In moments of doubt, of weariness, of wondering whether his struggle mattered, he could remember Ghana, could remember the 100,000 voices calling his name, could remember the feeling of African. Soil beneath his feet, could remember that he belonged to something larger than himself, something older than slavery, something stronger than oppression. He belonged to a people, a scattered people, a wounded people, but a people nonetheless. And that belonging, that recognition, that homecoming to a home he'd never known but somehow always remembered, was the greatest gift Ghana gave him. Greater than any applause, any acclaim, any achievement. The gift of knowing, finally and forever, that he was not alone, that he was part of a story that stretched backward through suffering and forward through hope, that 100,000 people were waiting for him, and they were waiting to say welcome home.